and the respondents were in their 30s having early onset dementia. Now, early onset dementia usually be defined as around 60, so that's quite young for individuals. And then also from my own personal, my brother Joel has Down syndrome, and he also now has dementia. And lovely ladies can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I heard that, we started looking into it a bit more and found that it was something like 50% of people with Down syndrome get dementia. I did not know it was that high. So whatever those stats and those numbers are, they're just too high, right? And so I think it's really great that we get to learn and get more information about these things and see, again, FASD as a whole body diagnosis and how these things can play a role for all of us, right? So at this time, I am very excited and privileged to introduce Mary. Mary is a professor of social work and social gerontology and principal lead, Rare Dementia Support Canada, Nipissing University. Her research focuses on the social context of aging and older age, with particular interest in atypical forms of dementia, the effects younger families. She is currently principal investigator of the Canadian Institute for Health Research funded study entitled A Realist Evaluation of Rare Dementia Supports, People's Spaces and Places. Dorothy is also joining. Dorothy is an assistant professor with the School of Social Work at Dementia University. She is Anishinabek from the Matachewan, I hope I said that right, Matachewan, oh, so close. Matachewan First Nation. Her research touches on the Indigenous method of non-interference as it relates to relationship building. She is currently in for RDS Canada in hopes of creating inclusion for developing an Indigenous component to the services that are offered. Her interests also lie with Indigenous communities developing research concerning early onset dementia from an Indigenous perspective. So please join me in welcoming our session presenters for today.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for inviting Dorothy and I to come and share this learning with you. I think the two of us feel like a little bit like fish out of water. Our specialty area is the other end of the lifespan and thinking about neurodegeneration rather than neurodivergence, although it has its relevance. So hopefully we can bring some messages together for you that resonate with many of the points that Shannon rose in her wonderful opening address to us, and get us thinking in terms of that children born with fetal alcohol syndrome and other neurodivergent disorders do age, and what are the consequences across the lifespan when we're living with these conditions, as well as trying to maintain healthy brains throughout our life course. So Dorothy, let me pass over to you briefly.
My name quickly. I am from the Matachewan First Nation, Minopin Nokwe, Nimpiknishis Dodem, and so that's my, obviously my Anishinabek way of introducing myself. I want to say miigwech for those who were able to be here this morning and start us off with the morning ceremony. I was hoping to make it, but being in a strange bed, strange place, I really didn't get to sleep too early last night, and so I had to wake up at 7:30 this morning rather than being here. So I really appreciate the people that were able to be here for us and start us out in that good way. I also want to say miigwech for the organizers that have invited us here and came and offered the same to guide us and help us in our learning processes here this morning. I'm hoping that I'll be able to pass on some knowledge of life ways that I know and understand that would include those of us who are neurodivergent in ways that we would look after that as Indigenous peoples and have looked after ourselves in a number of years. I really appreciated the fact this morning when the speakers spoke, because I wasn't sure, like Mary Pat was saying, feeling like I'm not too sure about all of this. But after listening to the speakers this morning, I'm home. I know I'm home. This is a good place for me to be. I know I can share things with you in a way that hopefully will be helpful to people. And so miigwech for that.
Thanks, Dorothy. So Dorothy and I have 4 principal messages that we want to share with you in the hour that we have together, and hopefully we can get you speaking a little bit as well. So we just want to talk very briefly about brain health across the lifespan and how important that is as we enter our adult and older years in relation to affecting probable or likelihood of disorders affecting the brain later in life. Thinking about neurodiversity and aging and what we know in terms of some of the neurodivergent disorders and what adulthood might look like in relation to risk for dementia. And then speaking briefly about young onset dementia. I use young onset rather than early onset. Young onset dementia and what that looks like for people in adulthood. And then just very briefly about what we're doing at Rare Dementia Support Canada to fill a gap in the Canadian landscape in terms of supporting people who are much younger but living with dementia. Dorothy, we wanted to get a little bit of a sense of who we're speaking to in the room. So can a few people just give us a shout out in terms of what you're doing or your specialty area, your work area? Child and youth worker, perfect.
Prenatal nutrition.
Okay. Nutrition?
Family representative.
Okay.
So I work as part of a student mental wellness team in education.
Okay. Student wellness, okay. So primarily everyone's working with children or youth.
Grandmother raising a child with shaken baby disorder.
Okay, a grandma, family supporter. Thank you. Early years education.
The reason I was curious, because when I first was presented with this, was I'm like, okay, how much do people understand already about it? Which is probably a lot more than I did at that point in time. And so listening to your background, I can understand some, because I worked in my own community back at home in different positions of providing support to families, helping families in our community move ahead. All of those things I've done, and so I can recognize some of those when you're mentioning that. And so I have kind of an idea of where you might be coming from, so that hopefully we'll be able to connect with that as we're moving along today. Okay? Oh, yeah. So this is an exercise we wanted to do. This is a workshop. I said, well, let's do something where the audience is interactive, where you're actually doing some work. And so this is your first work. Just answer this question. You can do it within your groups. And perhaps when you're done, maybe one person can just kind of give some examples of what you've done over the past week to keep your brain healthy. And I guess the first question that you probably might have is what that would be. Would you recognize what it is that you're doing to keep your brain healthy? And if you do, share it with your table, or actually, just explain that to
at your table. Throw some things together and then we'll share. What have you done over the past week? Great help.
Okay, I was going to use the microphone, but it's not doing what it's supposed to, so, oh, it is now. Try. I'm getting the signal. Is it working now?
Yeah.
That sounds like, okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I need the technicians around so I can move around. I'm not used to staying in one spot, obviously. I gotta move a bit when I'm talking. So let's have some examples of your past week and what you did for your brain. Or was you able to figure out things that you did specifically for your brain?
Between the three of us, there was art making, beadwork, and she's coloring right now. And I had said for myself, like, getting enough sleep, because I find like that affects so many different things. And we always teach the kids about the importance of getting enough sleep in terms of like brain health, mental health.
Right.
Going to bed early.
So people hear that, the main one was the sleep, but they also talk about eating and what was the other one?
Just art making, coloring.
Okay, art-based things. Somebody else had their hand up?
What about reading?
Reading? Yep, good one. Somebody else?
I use an app called Impulse, and it literally is for brain exercises
Oh,
with
okay.
all sorts of different like games that you can play, but it hits on different and working different parts of your brain.
Ah, good one. Yeah, yes.
I shared my group this past week. I got a Rubik's Cube. My 18-year-old son and I were going back and forth like
Rubik's Cube, yes. I remember that. I haven't done it for a while. Language? Yeah, learning it. Right.
I'm neurodivergent, so I learned that what really helps with my brain is doing like my special interests, which are I've noticed like when I watch videos and learning about my special interests, it really calms my brain down. And it actually also allows my brain to learn at the same time about different things like history, science, stuff like that, while also it's constant.
Okay, good. So that you're focusing on your interest, so it maintains your relaxing and being able to focus on what you want to learn, right? That kind of, right. Any other examples over there?
So things that were thrown out on our table were Wordle, Sudoku, word games, puzzles, reading, learning new things, rest, or doing something that you just personally enjoy, eating, drinking lots of water, walking, and eating.
So So that's a lot that your table came up with. I started with the word games and all of those things and ended with water. Making sure you have enough water, and there's lots of things in there. So keeping very active. Way at the back.
No alcohol shopping, so you have to calculate how much you spend. Social interaction with each other, the close relationships with our families. Puzzles.
Okay, good. Puzzles, close relationships, interacting with each other keeps the brain healthy and moving. And I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague here, Mary Pat, and let her continue on.
All excellent suggestions. There was an emphasis, though, wasn't there, in terms of keeping our brains active through learning a new language or engaging in art activities and so forth. There was an emphasis on that, right? Alongside social interaction and exercise and shopping. That one got me excited, but it was to calculate the price. I'm just glad to be out shopping regardless of what it involves. Maybe it's because of what you're doing and why we're here together. You're thinking about it in a very different way than most people do. A lot of people don't think about the most important organ in our body, the only organ we can't transplant, and how to ensure we keep our brain healthy across the lifespan. And when I work primarily with older people, as I'm a gerontologist, everybody thinks and talks about, well, as soon as I retire, I'm going to start doing crossword puzzles and I'm going to learn a new language. And those aren't things that we should be waiting to do once we're older. These are things we should be doing across the lifespan and how important that is. So some of the important things we're thinking about in terms of keeping our brain healthy, even if we are neurodivergent, even if we've been diagnosed with dementia, is sleep. That was mentioned, or rest, and how important it is for us to get a good night's sleep. Keeping our mood or our mental health in good form, in good shape. The importance of a healthy diet, so lots of fruits and veg and vegetable oil and or oils or olive oil instead of butter and so forth. So anything that's good for the heart is good for the brain. Exercise. We see more emphasis now on the importance of social connection in terms of keeping us connected and engaged in the world around us. But how easy it is when people have a neurodivergent condition or whether people are living with a neurodegenerative disease, how easily people can lose their connections because of their inability to stimulate those. They may need assistance in doing so, as well as then challenging our minds, like learning the new language or Sudoku or crosswords or artistic engagement or whatever. In terms of then our risk factors over our lifespan, our cardiovascular health, I think we all know about that in terms of, and the emphasis now, if you go to the family doctor, the first thing they're checking is diabetes and cholesterol. Head trauma, and head trauma in terms of an accident, but more awareness now in terms of repeated head traumas. So our young children who are engaging in sports, whether that's football or soccer or hockey, where the head is repeatedly or maybe repeatedly being hit. The social determinants of health for people who are living in poverty, for people who are living with intergenerational trauma, for people who don't have access to education and employment, alongside drugs and alcohol. And then the final point, the risk factors, are genes, the genetics, what we inherit from our parents, and our lack of ability to actually control that, but that may have an impact on us as our brain ages across the lifespan. So keeping in mind those protective factors and those risk factors, whether that we're born healthy, whether we're living with any particular brain or other condition, and whilst we're aging. So our brain is changing from the moment we're born. Right? The brain is developing and the brain is changing in terms of its structure, in terms of its metabolism and so forth across the lifespan. So as we age, our brain is beginning to shrink, and that's normal. It's not an abnormal shrinkage as we see in neurodegenerative diseases. The chemicals in our brains are changing, and those chemicals are impacting on how we sleep, how we move, how we feel. We have connections between the neurons that are reducing over time. That's all normal as we age. But we also have brain changes as we age that are quite interesting in terms of our brain's ability to connect with far distant regions in the brain, and how sometimes you see older people, and we used to call this wisdom, and I think we may still do that, is older people, their ability to see a big picture, their ability to make connections across very divergent forms of information. And that's because our brain over time has developed those connections in far regions. So we have positive things that can be happening, and we have things that are less positive. But this is happening regardless if we are living with a neurodivergent condition or not. Our brain is changing. And then of course, these changes are being impacted on our decisions around our health behaviors, whether we're avoiding the risk factors for poor brain health, or whether we're engaging in activities and behaviors to maintain good brain health. Now when we think about, and when Michelle contacted me about this session, and thinking about children who are living with neurodivergent conditions, and when I use that term, I'm talking about the more formal diagnosis like ADHD and fetal alcohol syndrome and others. What does that mean for those children as they transition into adulthood and older age? And the reality is that we've forgotten, in terms of the health and social care sector, that people living with chronic diseases, whether those are physical health diseases or people living with neurodivergent conditions, are living longer than they ever have. But we don't have, to this point, a sector of health and social care that nicely transitions children, for whatever reason they're being supported in children's services, and transitioning them over into the adult sector to continue to support them as they age. Right? The brain is naturally changing. We know that children with neurodivergent conditions, those symptoms can fluctuate over time. When children are going through puberty and there's hormonal changes as we enter adulthood, symptoms can fluctuate and change. In my work, in working in the adult sector around brain health and neurodegenerative diseases, children living with these neurodivergent conditions aren't getting a whole lot of attention in terms of what does adulthood look like for them in relation to the brain, as well as what does older age look like for them. And one of the things I think that's really important here, and you probably see this as well, is there's still a whole lot of stigma, isn't there, in terms of people living with these conditions. And the stigma in terms of adults living with dementia is equally as horrendous. So when we're talking about the brain, there's a lot of misconception, a lot of misunderstanding. And I think that's one of the reasons that people like myself and others who are researching these fields basically have neglected it. We're beginning to see glimpses now, but it has been neglected over time. And in terms of dementia specifically, my colleagues working in this field have primarily focused on dementia, you know, when grandma's 85 and she's forgetting to turn the stove off, when in fact there's another whole population that is experiencing dementia. The youngest person I worked with was 29 years old. So people much earlier in life who are living with neurodegenerative diseases. So let's just think about what we know and what I was able to learn and find in preparation for this workshop in terms of children living with neurodivergent conditions and dementia. And the first piece of literature, there's not a lot out there, were children living with on the autism spectrum disorder. And a study out of the United States, not a perfect study, but a study out of the United States telling us that children with autism are 2.6 times more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And that risk goes up if it's autism with an intellectual disability. Or we're going to come back to this, intellectual disabilities even higher than that. Now, what's really important here is that they're not only at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, but the diagnosis is being made much younger in life. So someone with autism being diagnosed at the age of 49, somebody with autism and an intellectual disability at the age of 51, for example. So not only are they at risk, but they're being diagnosed at a younger age, which then complicates things for us in terms of an assessment and a diagnosis. And we heard this morning with Shannon and the struggles to get an accurate diagnosis. This is no different because of the complications as we age and how we understand the brain and what we don't understand of the brain. When we think about ADHD, not a whole lot of knowledge there other than, and this study just came out and received press just 2 weeks ago around the globe with colleagues of mine from the United Kingdom, that we know that people living with ADHD have a much shorter life expectancy. Now, we don't really understand why that's so, but in looking at medical records of over 33,000 people in the United Kingdom, they could see that men had a shorter life expectancy by almost 7 years and women by closer to 9 years. The suspect here is that people with ADHD are making different lifestyle choices and living with unhealthy behaviors, possibly drinking too much, smoking too much, using drugs, but we also know that there's also a high risk of suicide. And Shannon shared her story in terms of some of those behaviors, those choices to cope with what they're living with, and how that puts us at risk in terms of life expectancy. If it's putting us at risk in terms of a lower life expectancy, it's also putting us at risk for being diagnosed with dementia. One of the other things that this study drew out, and which is drawn out in terms of some of the literature I looked at around fetal alcohol syndrome, is because of the fluctuation in symptoms over the lifespan. When people are showing changes in behavior or personality, and someone says off to the doctor, people are sometimes being diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, when really it's just a fluctuation in the condition they've been living with all their life, or in fact, people who've never been diagnosed in childhood that they have ADHD or fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, and now the doctors are telling them they're dementing, when in fact they're not. They haven't had the original diagnosis of the condition they've been living with all their life. When we look at Down syndrome, we know that people living with Down syndrome have a much greater risk of developing Alzheimer's as they age. And we know the life expectancy for people living with Down syndrome is increasing as well, and why we're seeing more and more people being diagnosed. Now, this is a condition that's been explored for many, many years, and so neurologists have begun to understand this and why people living with Down syndrome are at risk. And what in fact the reason is because of this extra chromosome they're carrying. This chromosome is is causing the creation of what they call plaques and tangles in the brain, which is the hallmark identification for Alzheimer's disease. So the chemicals that are being produced in the brain are causing these problems, and hence the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. The expression of the disease is different, and for those of you working with children in neurodivergent conditions, you see those conditions being expressed differently as well. People with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease might express it differently than an older person with Alzheimer's disease. And one of the hallmark identificators here is the onset of epilepsy, which we wouldn't normally see in an older person with dementia. And then,
sorry, just one. The onset of epilepsy may be the first symptom.
Yeah.
Is that specifically to Down syndrome, or is that for anyone that may have dementia?
No, that's for people with Down syndrome. So it's expressing itself differently in that population. Oops. When we look at adults living with fetal alcohol syndrome, and I put in brackets here undiagnosed, because this is what comes to the neurologist's office. People are showing changes in personality and or behavior, being diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which is the first diagnosis before they give you the label of dementia, when in fact it's fetal alcohol syndrome that's never been diagnosed. But I can't find any literature that speaks to people living with fetal alcohol syndrome into older age and what are their risks. We know that alcohol is a problem throughout the life course. People who are drinking too much can cause dementia. But I was unable to locate anything specific to fetal alcohol syndrome. I don't know if any of you are aware of literature. I know that they've been doing questionnaires and asking people, and that there's some indication through survey results from people living with this condition of being diagnosed. But we don't have any more objective evidence from healthcare records, for example, to see what the diagnostic rate is. So then we think now we have people living with neurodivergent conditions, people who aren't living with neurodivergent conditions, and our brains are now aging. And you and I have made some good choices, maybe we've made some bad choices in terms of keeping our brain healthy. Well, as we enter adulthood, now we're talking about another 100 plus conditions or diseases that can cause dementia. And dementia is a real complex puzzle in our brain, no different than other neurological conditions in terms of understanding what the brain is doing or not doing, and how that's impacting on a person's ability to maintain their own independent day-to-day functioning, and how you and I, those of us who are working in the support and care sector, how to best support these individuals. So for those of you who don't know, right, dementia is a symptom. Dementia is a cluster of symptoms caused by a disease. Okay, so dementia isn't the disease, it's the symptom of a disease. And this can affect our memory, it can affect changes to our language, it can affect changes to our motor skills, the way we think, the judgments we make, our personality, we may have hallucinations, and we may have obvious changes in behavior. Now those symptoms are expressed differently depending on the disease. So memory impairment is a hallmark symptom for Alzheimer's disease, but a change in personality is a hallmark for another disease. A change in vision and perception is the hallmark of another disease. And so we're equally having challenges in adulthood in terms of determining what it is that is causing this person to change now at this stage in life. I hope you can see that chart. But right there is a chart of the number of diseases and conditions or syndromes that can cause someone to have dementia in adulthood. And they range from things like HIV, head traumas, and vascular dementia through to Alzheimer's disease and several different variants, to frontal temporal disease and several different variants, and so forth. And what's really important in terms of neurodivergence and neurodegeneration later in life, as much as it is in childhood, is each of these diseases and syndromes will express itself differently in that individual. And so when we talk about person-centered or family-centered support, this is where it's a challenge for you and I in terms of trying to shape systems of care that can be flexible and can be tailored according to the disease or the disorder that the person's living with and the challenges that the family and the individual may be having living with these diseases. So when we talk about young onset dementia, this is dementia typically diagnosed by, earlier than the age of 65. But it is very subjective, and when we think about, 65 is the new 45, right? And 85 is the new 65. So a 70-year-old may consider dementia at that age as young onset. An 18-year-old might think, well, no, that's an old person. But it's all very subjective. But we use the old pensionable age as the cutoff. And what happens, and not too different than Shannon's story, is people often will spend years trying to get an accurate diagnosis, when they're 45 years old, because we don't expect a 45-year-old to be diagnosed with dementia. And so their symptoms will be explained by a psychiatric disorder, their symptoms will be explained by substance misuse, their symptoms will be explained by, you're just stressed. For women, these symptoms will be explained as just menopause and hormonal changes, when in fact there is a disease. These different disorders, these young onset disorders, affect up to 20% of all people diagnosed with dementia. But for most of the world, we're familiar with Alzheimer's disease and people forgetting to turn the stove off or forgetting to take their medication. They're unrecognized. We don't hear a lot about these different disorders. Does anybody know of posterior cortical atrophy in the room? That's a variant of Alzheimer's disease, which affects the back of the brain, which affects a person's vision. There's no memory impairment. There's no language problems. They just can't see properly because the message from the eye to the back of the brain is impaired. So their symptoms are vision. They go to the doctor tells them to go get new glasses. They're dementing. So these diseases aren't well known and they're under-recognized, and so when we're going to the doctor and we're trying to get a diagnosis, not unlike Shannon's story, it's repeated visits, it's repeated specialists, it's, for us in Northern Ontario, repeated travels to Toronto to see a neurologist who specializes in these diseases to try to get a diagnosis. The supports that are available for people living with dementia are tailored to older people. The Alzheimer's Society primarily shapes their supports for an older population, not the 29-year-old, not the 35-year-old, and not the 45-year-old. In terms of Indigenous populations, we have an increasing body of knowledge helping us to understand dementia in Indigenous peoples. And what we're learning now is that more and more people are being diagnosed with dementia. Indigenous peoples, their life expectancy is increasing. But what we're also seeing is that the diagnosis is much younger and the onset is much younger than in the rest of the population. So more and more younger adults in Indigenous population are being diagnosed with dementia. And Dorothy and I spent a lot of time talking about this in terms of Indigenous ways of knowing dementia. And how people living with dementia are being supported in the community where they can be, or being removed from the community when they can't be supported, and trying to understand. There's a number of researchers now beginning to understand why is it that we're seeing it in a younger population, and is there something to do with generations of colonialism and intergenerational trauma and other social determinants of health in these communities. In terms of just briefly thinking about the impact and how we talk about supporting children with neurodivergent conditions, we talk very similarly from an adult perspective and a young adult perspective in terms of how does somebody share with friends and family and their employer when they're 45 that they've been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease? And how can we support that person, whether that's a mom or whether that's a dad, to continue to be mom or continue to be dad despite living with this neurodegenerative disease? Or how can we support that person in employment for as long as possible, given that some of these disorders, right, like posterior cortical atrophy that I mentioned, it's affecting vision, but the person is still able to engage in the world in every other respect. But as soon as you hear the word dementia, well, we quickly wrap things up and send people home to get their life in order to prepare to die. So we're seeing huge disruptions in normal family transitions and individual transitions, employment disruptions and loss of income for family when you can't get a disability pension until a doctor officially gives a diagnosis, and people are waiting up to 5 years to get a diagnosis, and so can't access financial supports. We have people who are looking after their parents who are now dementing and can no longer engage in their role as supporting the older generation. We have the loss and the important loss of intergenerational, Dorothy's giving me a funny look, intergenerational transmission of knowledge and values, and limited access to any type of rehabilitation or supports for people living with these young onset dementias. And as we've already heard today, the importance of holistic care. It's the entire body, it's the entire person, and well-being across a spectrum of areas of our life. Do you want to say something? Okay.
Back on here. We only have like 4 minutes left, so I just wanted to make sure that I kind of brought us around to my understanding of this, and listening this morning to how we as people have taken care of our own in our own ways. And that's what Mary Pat was alluding to. It's part of the reason when she's sharing, and I believe that you would have gotten that impression too, of how open she is to bringing in new ways of understanding. And so that's part of the reason why I connected with her and have decided to work with her in trying to look at more of what is happening with dementia with Indigenous peoples. Trying to encourage people to come and work with this to help not just ourselves, because I believe personally that science is catching up to us with knowledge, much as what Mary Pat's saying. They're catching up to what our understanding is of taking care of each other holistically. And so it's catching up to us, so we have something, don't know what something is quite yet, but we have something to share with the world that will help with that. I really and truly believe that. It's part of the reason why I connected with Mary Pat. I believe that's part of it too. And so I wanted to just relate to you that piece of it, that there is that connection. Mary Pat's my science side for me, and then I put it together with all the teachings I've picked up over the years as an Indigenous person. And so being able to work with that form, I need people to come and sit with me and do that work with me to move it ahead. So if there's anybody willing here and able to do that, because it's going to be across Canada, I welcome you. Definitely do that. So I just wanted to put that in there, right? Bringing it back to the reason the FASD and the neurodivergence. Neurodivergence as a word has made the space where my understanding is that it puts everything coming together instead of like science taking it all apart. So all of those different things that Mary Pat has talked about is neurodivergence, but it's bringing it all together in one word. So their language is becoming more of a community-based language in English. And so I'm going to leave it at that, so you can close up.
Okay, just to wrap up, I was taught as a young social worker that if there's a problem, you got to do something about it. And so in my work over the years, recognizing that young families who were dealing with dementia at home, and there was nowhere to get help or support. Fortunate with funding from the Hillary and Galen Weston Foundation here in Canada, I was able to set up a new support community called Rare Dementia Support Canada. And why we use the word rare is the conditions aren't all that rare, although these are conditions being diagnosed in people who are much younger. And so we have a new community where people are accessing individual and couple and family support, as well as we have virtual support groups where somebody living with posterior cortical atrophy in Victoria is connecting with someone living in Winnipeg, who's connecting with someone in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and connecting with someone here in Sault Ste. Marie. And they meet up virtually to connect and learn from one another in terms of looking for solutions and how to navigate day-to-day life when you're living with these neurodegenerative diseases. And so that is, we're now working with almost 1,000 people across the country with young onset dementia to learn and support and learn together in terms of how to navigate the impact on individuals and the family's life. Like Shannon said, the entire family went to therapy to support her. This is the same circumstance. We have 15-year-olds who have to go visit dad in the nursing home on the weekends. How do you help the young lad go visit dad in the nursing home when all his friends are out at hockey? Versus a wife, versus an 18-year-old who's just gone to university and trying to stay in education while coping with dad who's declining. We're going to wrap up because of the time. We were going to return in terms of thinking about brain health again, but we'll leave it at that and allow people to wrap up so we're not holding back people from lunch, because I see that it's there and people can smell it. They're going to start racing towards it. So thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Pat and Dorothy. A lot of great information. It was really helpful. I was able to actually find a slide. You just pull it up quickly here in regards to FASD and dementia. This has actually been published in social work book something. I will find out at lunch. but it's, the health survey itself has actually been published. So here's one of the stats that we did find was that individuals with FASD, early onset dementia, again that's around the age of 64 I believe, was 104 times higher for individuals with FASD. And as you can see here, it said 4 individuals who reported dementia all were in their early 50s or younger. You even had a report from somebody in their 30s.
Oh, go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
again, understanding why it's important to get this information and learn these things, as you said from the ladies here, you know, things are happening at younger ages, so we have to be aware, get the information so that we know what we're looking for, because it's affecting everybody, right, in different ways, and I think it's really important to know and understand that it's not just your 80-year-old grandma, right? My brother's 35, I believe, and he got diagnosed with dementia when he was probably 4 years ago, something like that, so pretty young. So again, thank you so much. It allows us to see and understand FASD as a whole body diagnosis, which allows us to talk about the medical part of FASD, which is a different conversation that a lot of times in society we're a lot more comfortable to talk about the medical part rather than, you know, the drinking and pregnancy and all those things. So it's great to have this information to open other conversations. So again, thank you so much for your time. At this time, I am going to call up Michelle. Is Michelle in the room? I think she's not. So I'm going to try to bring out my inner Michelle here. Like, okay guys, so that's what we're gonna do. Okay, is like, we're gonna use this time to go around those tables to talk to those people and be like, what are you doing here, right? So like, use this kind of network and people, but like, use the time to find out why people are here, what's going on, right? Like, if we work together, if we partner, like, what is it we do? What is it that I do? Like, why are we here?
So what we're gonna do, ready? I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing? Oh yeah, this one. Okay. I was like expecting us to, I was waiting for the next half of the group to come over there. I was standing there waiting. I'm like, where are they coming? Why aren't they here? Because I didn't look at my own schedule. It's good. So we're gonna do a little bit of networking. So what's going to happen is, if you are from the southeast, you are going to make the sound of a bear. If you are from the southwest, where's Linda? Hey Linda. You're going to make the sound of an eagle. Okay? If you are from Lake Huron, you're going to make the sound of a wolf. If you are from Northern Superior, you're going to make the sound, what else do I have, Linda?
A cat.
Moose. Oh, yeah, like a bison, like a buffalo. Buffalo. So, everybody got their sound? So, the name of the game is you're going to find your region. So, you're going to make the sound. Oh, you are the southwest. Okay? So, you're going to make that sound and find the other people from your region. Once you find those people, all the people from your region, you're going to pick 4 people that you have never met before or don't know. And you're going to come up here and grab a piece of paper. On that paper are going to be questions you're going to ask each other. You're going to get to know each other so you can network with people in your region. Everybody got it? So I want to hear the sound, so there should be groups of people forming based on their sounds in different parts of the room.
Buffalo. I'm a buffalo.
We need the sound. Am I going to make the sound? Yeah.
I'm just going to give an example here. As I am from Vancouver, my sound shall be a horse. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I said the south, east. You guys, what did I say? Word for southeast. Bear, right? So what's bear say? Okay, that sounds good. If you're the southwest, you're an eagle, right? What does an eagle say? What's an eagle say? Get your wings out. There you go. And then if you're from Lake Huron, you guys are the wolf. Right. And then if you're from Northern Superior, you're a buffalo.
Yeah, that'd be Thunderbag. Or the wolf.
What's buffalo say?
Or the wolf.
Linda, Linda's gonna play us one.
It's a buffalo.
Okay, ready? What is who?
We're wolves. You're wolves.
Lake Huron. Okay, you guys stand up, go find your people. And then when you find more people that you do not know, come find me.